We can now bring in Andrew Smith, lecturer in liberal arts at Queen Mary University, London. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us here on the program. Now, it seems that with each new strike, more and more people keep taking to the streets. What does that tell you about the government's messaging?
I think it tells you in many ways that at the current moment, it looks like Macron's party has lost control of the narrative. It looks like the government has, of course, been communicating and been trying to hit the airwaves and say that there's a necessity to push through these reforms, that the pension system needs to be saved. But I think what we're actually seeing is that public opinion has swayed with the unions. It's united the unions against the reforms. People are supporting the protests by and large. And this seems to be really that the government is losing control of that narrative.
Macron keeps saying that he won re-election with the promise that he was going to reform the country's pension system. But the fact of the matter is, he also won the presidency because a lot of people voted for him in order to keep Marine Le Pen from power. Is that fact lost on the president?
It's quite a challenging one, isn't it?
Considering that a couple of months later, he lost the majority in parliament.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really difficult one. And you're right, there's some really difficult calculations that need to be done here as well. If we look back to when Emmanuel Macron responded to the Yellow Vest protests, for example, he said in interviews, look, I think it seems like I've been sort of reforming against the French people. And if I seemed, I think at the time he said, if I seemed impatient with this, I wasn't impatient with the French people. But once again, it actually seems like he's arrived back at that stage once again. People feel like he's governing against the French people. And of course, that's very much the criticism that somebody like Olivier Faure, of course, the new secretary of the PS, has put across. He said, look, Macron can't continue to be sort of deaf to these demands and refuse to negotiate. All we hear from Elisabeth Borne, the Prime Minister, is that the raising the age of retirement is non-negotiable. We hear this word non-negotiable again and again, it's settled. And yet we hear other Renaissance deputies saying actually what this period of debate in the Assembly is going to be for is almost to help shape the thing and to kind of raise awareness and understanding of it. So there's a real difficulty, I think, in terms of those electoral calculations, like you say, about how Macron manages the Assembly in this process.
Now, he's ruled out using the Article 49.3 of the French Constitution, which essentially means he could push through the legislation without any debate. He's saying we're not going to do that for now. But what if he is forced to do that? What sort of reaction can we expect from the street?
I think that's absolutely, like you've said, the idea of, well, first of all, if he'd lost control of the narrative right now, and there is certainly, we look at people like Philippe Martinez is bringing up this idea again that Macron has this is an ego test. This is about trying to kind of have a show of strength at the start of his, Philippe Martinez, of course, the CGT secretary, the head of the union, but trying to show strength about this reform at the start of his term. Now, I think if this relies on these types of constitutional measures to enact that show of strength, I think that goes very badly. Already, we've seen even the moderate unions like the CFDT have said, Laurent Berger, who is the kind of secretary there, he said, look, this raising the age is another red line. We cannot go with you. If you've lost even the most moderate unions, you've united public opinion against you, something needs to change. And you're right, it can get worse if the government continues on that path and says, actually, not just have we lost this battle, as it were, but we're going to force it through using a constitution, a sort of anti-democratic, force. And that, I think, is actually quite a dangerous move.
Because Macron is just 1 year into his second term in office. If he backtracks on reforming the country's pension system, then what does he do for the rest of his presidency? Sit on his hands, essentially?
It's a challenge, and that's exactly what some of the majority MPs are saying. We've got people like Olivier Dussopt, the Labour Minister, who's saying, we need to save this pension scheme, we need to sort this out, because the reality they're saying is actually they need the savings, as it were, from making these pension reforms in order to unlock the potential of doing all these other reforms that they want to enact, in order to sort of unleash the idea of France's development. Now, those are the plans for the remainder of the term. Those are the plans for the remainder of Macron's legacy. Now, that's a real challenge, because if they do back down, like you say, they lose a lot of that authority. They lose the ability to really lead in that European discussion in terms of, things like consolidated debt and ideas of, budget reform. And that really challenges Macron's ability to do a lot of things. So I think it is a show of strength. I think it is a show of force. And this has become something which has fallen back into that old left-right divide, which pits Macron on the centre right of this discussion.
But France is one of those complicated countries because everyone realizes that you need to reform the country's pension system, but at the same time, when you come to touching the pension system, you're touching on a nerve essentially. So maybe if the government shows some flexibility on it when it comes to this age, do you think that will make any reform more palatable?
I think you're absolutely right. I think if this debate can shift to one that is about details, whether it be about qualifying years or the headline age or something like that, then I think he can chip away at this unified front with the unions and this idea of the strikes against them. If it remains about yes or no, the government versus the people, governing and reforming against the French people, there that problem remains. So I think, yeah, absolutely. At the moment, we can see some room for negotiation, and that is because to actually satisfy that sort of electoral arithmetic, remember, Renaissance have they do not have enough MPs to actually force this through as an absolute majority. They've got 250, they need 289. So they need to rely on the Republicans to actually come in and support them. Already we can see in the press that some Republican deputies are saying, maybe. Already some Renaissance MPs are wavering as well. And so I think actually they need to negotiate with them as much as with anyone else. And so that's where the big difficulty is going to be in the immediate future.
I mean, I don't think he would do this, but do you think he could essentially dissolve Parliament? But because that way he could shoot himself in the foot and lose whatever seats he has.
Yeah, absolutely. The spectre always exists, doesn't it? There's always this worry about the reshuffle or the dissolution of Parliament. And this is always a kind of something hanging in the background. Now, this is really dangerous. That would be gambling with France's future. And you mentioned the way that Macron won the presidency. Many people saying they were voting against the Rassemblement National, the far right. Now, actually, the difficulty is if we move into this dynamic of the government against the people, of reform against the people and their voices, that type of very impassioned, very angry debate, which pitches those kind of populist notes of the people against elites, is really risks, I think, empowering and emboldening many of those very worst tendencies in terms of parliamentary politics.
You spoke about populist tendencies, and finally, I want to ask you about that bit because let's just say, for argument's sake, the government does manage to push through this reform, however democratically, or if they have to use 49.3 of the French Constitution. What happens in 4 years' time when there's the election again? Macron would have been gone by then because he can only serve 2 terms. There is no replacement for now. And isn't this something that someone on the far left or far right can use to gain the presidency? The promise to reverse whatever Macron does when it comes to reforming the pension system.
Absolutely. We saw that in the previous presidential. There was a sense of the fact that this was, for many of his opponents, people were trying to set this up as a referendum on Emmanuel Macron, his government, his policies, or at least the image of them that they were creating in the press. And I think actually that will be the same situation again. We can already see some people who want to be candidates, we think probably, for that next presidential. People like Edouard Philippe. He's one of the characters who is saying, actually, maybe we could put in some sort of review point for this in 2027 in terms of the reforms. And then we can take that out of the presidential politics and back in to Parliament. And really, I think those types of kind of quite elegant deals are the things that are probably going to mean whether this passes or not. It's going to be that discussion, and it probably takes it out of the streets where we know the message, we understand the unified voice, and into those kind of moments of parliamentary discussions and about the arithmetic that comes with that.
We'll see how the protests shape up today and on Saturday. Andrew Smith, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us on the program.